Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Fareed Zakaria.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's an enormous pleasure to be here, to be introduced in that very kind way. It's an enormous thrill to come up on a big stage like this, a grand way to enter a room. It's not the grandest entry I've ever seen. The grandest entry I ever saw was made by Muammar Gaddafi a couple of years ago. I was the last Western journalist to interview Gaddafi. And it was a very strange, surreal experience. It was about midnight when I finally got to see him at the mission of the Libyan mission of to the UN. You remember this is about 2 years ago. Gaddafi came to New York after a long absence because he had finally come in from the cold, renounced his nuclear weapons, and therefore got a visa to attend the United Nations General Assembly. Well, we were in the UN mission, and I was standing there waiting around, and there was this enormous bed sheet right next to me, and Gaddafi was on the other side of it. Well, why? Why the bed sheet? Well, it turns out Muammar Gaddafi does not like to live in houses or apartments. He likes to live in tents. He's a Bedouin. Plan A had been that he was going to rent Donald Trump's house in Bedford, New York, and pitch a tent in the backyard. The good townspeople of Bedford heard about this plan and passed a city ordinance which went something like no tents in Bedford this week. So plan B was that they pitched the tent in the lobby of the Libyan mission to the UN, which happened to have very high ceilings. So there I was, waiting for Gaddafi across from this enormous bedsheet. And it had been hours, and we'd been negotiating, and finally, after much negotiation, they assured us the interview was back on track. It was going to happen. And I said, well, we need to get going. This is New York, and I've got a camera crew here, and we're paying them triple overtime because it's midnight. And they said, don't worry, he's coming out. I said, when will we know that we're ready to start rolling? They said, you'll know. And at that moment, a number of very striking, beautiful African women walked out. They were all wearing military fatigues of various kinds. They were all wearing high-heel boots, and they all had Kalashnikov rifles strapped to their breasts. This is Gaddafi's Amazonian Guard. They said that it precedes him wherever he goes. I looked them up in Wikipedia the next day, and it said that they were all virgins, which made me think, do not always believe what you read in Wikipedia. And at that moment, a Libyan official comes out and he says, pray be silent, for the guide of the revolution approaches. And at that moment, Muammar Gaddafi walks in and the interview begins. So that certainly was a more dramatic entry than mine, maybe for the next year's lecture. For all you know, the Amazonian Guard might be available for rent. Look, what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about these extraordinary events taking place in the Middle East and how they relate to broader trends that have been taking place around the world. Because there's a tendency to look at these kinds of things in isolation. And I think it's very important to recognize the breadth and depth of what is going on in the Middle East. Think about this. Over the last decades, there have been so many events that have seemed likely to spill over or to produce some kind of broader conflagration. And they don't. I was in Iraq in 2006. This was the worst period for Iraq. Everything was falling apart. The country was in chaos. If you went and flew 45 minutes away to Jordan, which was the only place you could fly initially, and you had to fly using this corkscrew pattern to make sure that the missiles didn't hit the plane. If you'd fly to Jordan 45 minutes away, it was booming. It was as if there was nothing to worry about from the violence in Iraq. The same was true in Dubai. The violence in Iraq is remarkably self-contained. If you look at Afghanistan, countries falling to pieces, you go to India, neighboring India, there's simply no effect. The Indian economy booms, Indian society seems totally unconcerned. You look at coups that took place in Thailand. None of this spilled over the last 2 decades. It's a really remarkable thing about the globe. That people were expecting so many of those events to turn into broader events, and they didn't. But look at what's happened in the Middle East. A small shopkeeper sets himself on fire in Tunisia only a few months ago. And look at where we are now. 2 peaceful revolutions have dislodged dictatorships that have been firmly entrenched for decades. Libya is in a state of civil war with an armed insurrection against Gaddafi's 42-year reign. You have an ongoing revolt against the regime in Yemen. You have protests now spreading in Syria throughout the country in a seemingly unstoppable manner. And you have serious protests in almost every other place, from Bahrain to Jordan to Morocco. That's all happened in 3 months, right? It tells you that there's something broader at work here. There's a broader, deeper cause. I would argue that we are witnessing a kind of Arab awakening that we have not seen in centuries. It may not be an exaggeration to actually say that the Arab people are for the first time trying to achieve a kind of sovereignty and independence that perhaps they have not had for 1,000 years. What do I mean by that? Well, the Arab world, Arab civilization as we know it today, burst upon the world stage in the 6th and 7th centuries AD, and it brought to the world this new religion, a powerful, charismatic, religious leader, military leader, political leader, and the religion spread along with Arab power, and it spread very far, very fast. Islam spread to Portugal, to Spain, to Central Asia, and became one of the world's great religions in a very short period of time. But then a funny thing begins to happen in the Arab world itself. The Arab military supremacy and military prowess begins to wane, and you see in the Arab world a series of invasions and conquests in which the Arabs are now conquered and dominated by foreign armies, the Mongols, the Persians, and eventually the Ottomans. By about the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire is firmly in control of all the lands of the Middle East, all the lands of Arabia, and rules it. And Ottoman power continues to flourish throughout the area. This is an empire that you recall lasts for 500-600 years. At the end of the 18th century, as Ottoman power is beginning to wane, a small expedition from Napoleon, from Napoleon's France, goes to Egypt, and remarkably is able to conquer all of Egypt, defeat the Egyptian army. And then, in a short period of time, it itself is defeated or suffers a setback and leaves. Not because the Egyptian army defeated it, but because the Royal Navy defeated the French. So you begin to see the rise of another phase of imperial domination, this time Europe's great empires. It is most vividly seen, of course, in 1919 after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapses and French and British diplomats literally carve and create the modern Middle East. They create whole new countries that had never existed before. Iraq, Jordan. They find old families in these places and turn them into monarchies. The ancient Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, for example, is a family that was stumbled upon by the British in 1920, and they decided to make them the ancient Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. With very nice stationery and lots of nice royal traditions, but they don't date back that far. That reality of European imperial domination persists until the collapse of those European empires. 1945 is the beginning of the end, as it were, the end of World War II. But of course, the Middle East becomes the great chessboard for the superpowers. And the two superpowers inherit the European colonial mantle in the Middle East. And each superpower picks its own allies, funds them, supports them, guarantees their security, and thus that great imperial game continues in the Middle East. until the Cold War itself ends in 1989. And then you are left with one superpower. And all the countries of the Middle East have to decide they will either make their peace with the United States or they will look for other sponsors. And you found in a country like Syria, it found a sponsor in Iran. In a country like Libya, after trying various avenues for many years, it decided it would make its peace with the United States, or so it thought a few years ago when Gaddafi decided to dismantle his nuclear weapons and come in from the cold. But then in the last 10 years, a strange thing happened to the America's imperial mission in the Middle East. And I use the word imperial here to mean a very large outside force that has the ability to dominate. I don't mean that the United States was actually colonizing any of these countries. But America's imperial mission begins to waver because the United States decides it has neither the will nor the capacity to play this imperial role. Why? Well, it loses the will because it realizes that the game America has been playing, and the Soviet Union was, and the British and French before, was to support some very tough, unsavory regimes. And these regimes had gotten tougher and more unsavory over the last 3 decades. But there was a cost to this. There was a side cost, what economists would call a negative externality. And this was that by supporting these brutal dictatorships, the United States had allowed or allowed for a system in which extreme opposition movements had grown in each of these countries. And in many of those cases, these were extreme religiously based terrorist organizations, and they all regarded the United States as one of their principal adversaries, if not their principal enemy, because it had supported all these regimes. And so there was a national security cost that became vividly clear on September 11, 2001, to having played this imperial role in the Middle East. And that began the wavering of America's will. You saw it in the Bush Freedom Agenda, which talked about pushing for democracy in the Middle East. You saw it in the way in which it specifically targeted and pushed for democratic reform in all these regimes. You see it in the WikiLeaks cables, where clearly American diplomats spend a great deal of time trying to push these regimes toward greater and greater openness. And you saw it with Obama, with the Cairo speech, and with the continued emphasis on reform in the Middle East. In other words, basically, our support for these regimes became qualified rather than unqualified, became one in which we were trying to persuade them to change rather than to stay the same. And this is not lost on the opposition movements in all these regimes and on the street protests in all these regimes. You can imagine that Egyptian protesters looking at all this would say, we bet that if we do a large street protest in Cairo, in Tahrir Square, say, the United States will not unequivocally support the Mubarak regime if it were to decide to crack down. And that would have been a shrewd calculation because, in fact, the United States did not unequivocally support the Mubarak regime when it decided to crack down. That's the will, the intention. The second part of America's imperial mission is, of course, the capacity. America became an overextended empire over this last decade, an empire that had fought 2 wars, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, neither of which had come to any ready or easy conclusion, both of which had sapped it of enormous strength, both in terms of blood and treasure, an imperial power that was extended in other parts of the world, from Yemen to Somalia, and also one that had suffered the greatest economic calamity since the Great Depression. So those 2 factors, the loss of will, the loss of capacity, meant that the United States was not likely to play that old imperial game. And this began to open up the forces that were already building in the Middle East, forces of a youth movement, stemming from a youth bulge, technology, democratization, all these forces are coming together. Take the youth bulge. There's a simple rule in life. Whenever you have too many young men in any country, you have trouble. If you look at history, you will basically find that wherever there are youth bulges, there's turmoil of some kind. And it's largely, I hate to say it, it's basically a problem with young men. The political scientist James Q. Wilson used to say, if you want to solve the problem of violent crime in America, it's very simple. Just arrest all the young men between the ages of 15 and 25. Violent crime will decline by 98%, because that's who does it. And if you think about it, throughout history, one of the primary tasks of civilization has been what to do with young men, which is why you have military academies and boarding schools and all that stuff, right? I mean, the women take care of themselves. It's the men you have to channel into soccer or armies or Wall Street to channel those aggressive instincts into something else. Well, you look through history, whenever you see a youth bulge, you see trouble. The French Revolution is preceded by a youth bulge. The Iranian Revolution is preceded by a youth bulge. If you look at the United States, by the way, the peak year of America's youth bulge over the last 100 years was 1968. Basically, what it means is that the kids decide they don't need to listen to the parents. The Middle East is going through the largest youth bulge in recorded history. 65% of the region is under the age of 30. In a country like Yemen, 70%, 72%, I think, by a recent count, is under the age of 30. So this is huge youth population, and it is dissatisfied because it faces an economy that is not able to absorb it. It faces job prospects that are uncertain, and it faces a lack of inclusiveness and respect and dignity, even in places where there was some economic growth, like Egypt or Tunisia. The second piece of this is, of course, the technology part, and everybody has focused on one element of it, which is Facebook. Facebook is important, but I think this is a much broader story. The real story is that if you go back 10 years and you had gone to Egypt, the only thing Egyptians could watch was state television. And what state television in Egypt was, it was the daily diary of the dictator, the daily diary of Hosni Mubarak. It would begin by, the evening news would begin by saying, Mr. Mubarak got up this morning and went and opened a primary school. And then he went and had lunch with the Qatari foreign minister, and they discussed the peace process. And then he went to a trade meeting, and so on. I mean, literally, that was the evening news. It was a kind of running show in which the only hero was the dictator of the country. You substitute Ben Ali for Mubarak in Tunisia, and so on. What changed then was the satellite revolution. And all of a sudden, people in the Middle East could watch Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and CNN and BBC. And what these did, particularly the Arab language ones, of course, which they had much, much wider penetration, was give people in the Middle East a sense of what was going on in the world, what real news was, a sense of what the rest of the world looked like, and a great discussion. Al Jazeera's talk shows were filled with this, and are filled with this day after day, of the discontents of Middle Eastern people, something you never see or hear on state media. So that was the first revolution. The second revolution was the internet revolution. The internet revolution was really about being able to question the regime's narrative of what had happened. So the Egyptian protests begin because an Egyptian young man is taken and arrested, tortured probably, and this begins a narrative in which the regime puts out one version of what happened. And then you find websites that start protesting and saying, no, that's not what happened. And here's video to prove it, and here's photographs to prove it, here's testimony to prove it. And you could do all this because it was the internet anonymously, or largely anonymously. And that reality that you were able to contest the version of events being provided by the regime and share it with wide groups of people was the second revolution. And the third, of course, was the social networking revolution, where you lower dramatically the costs of organizing, of cooperating. And this makes it possible to have protests around the world. All these three things come together, and they break the most powerful part of a regime, of a dictatorship's power, which is the control of information. And you expose these societies to the outside world. It's important to remember how recent this technological revolution is. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. The country right next to Kuwait is Saudi Arabia, and they're terrified because they think if Saddam Hussein is invading Kuwait for the oil, Well, Saudi Arabia is where the mother lode of oil is, and all those tanks have to do is keep driving, and they will get to Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis are trying to figure out what to do. Do we invite the Americans in? Do we not? It's a difficult decision. It's a conservative society. It is a conservative monarchy. The king is, 80 years old. The king in Saudi Arabia, by the way, is always 80 years old. They have this very strange system. They have a snail space succession where if the king dies, his next oldest brother becomes the king. And there are 66 of them. So by the time it gets to be your turn, you're going to be 80. You're going to, you might as well write it into the Constitution. In fact, the current king is 87. So anyway, the king at the time says, you know what? I need some time to think about this. Let's not tell anyone that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And for 9 days, it is a Saudi state secret that their next door neighbor was invaded. Ask yourself, even in Saudi Arabia today, how long could you keep that secret? Right? 3 minutes? Because you've got CNN, you've got BBC, you've got Al Jazeera, you've got Al Arabiya, you've got all the websites in the world, you've got mobile phones. What is Twitter? Twitter is a social networking system that says, answer the question in 140 characters, what are you doing right now? And so all you needed was some guy in Kuwait to tweet, I'm being invaded by Iraq, right? And that single tweet breaks the monopoly of the state's control over education. It breaks the Saudi state secret. Think about how amazing that is. And then you think about all those protest movements and how difficult it was to shut them down because these groups would keep organizing using cell phones and using social networks. That's the extraordinary technological shift. So you have to understand it all. It's partly happening in the realm of high politics and the drawing back of this imperial support. It's partly happening because it's being fueled from below by this youth bulge. And it's partly happening because of this extraordinary technological revolution that has been sweeping the world and has been sweeping the Middle East. And they all come together. And what you end up with is this extraordinary drama that we're watching, and that is not likely to end anytime soon. I wrote at the time the Tunisian revolt began that this thing seemed huge. And I think I may have underestimated it because I initially thought, well, it probably won't reach Syria because the Syrians are so good at repression and they are so brutal. But you know what? It has reached Syria. And so when I hear people now who tell me it won't reach Saudi Arabia, I don't know. I think there are reasons to believe that the Saudi system is pretty stable. Saudi monarchy, unlike all those other ones I mentioned, was not created by the British. It is a homegrown tribal system. They also have a royal family that has intermarried into the society and maintains very good relations with it. It's not even really right to call it a royal family. It's about 60,000 people. It's a tribe that rules Saudi Arabia. And of course, the small matter of the money. The Saudi Arabians have eye-popping amounts of money with which to bribe their people. There are really two methods of control in the Middle East: mass repression and mass bribery. Syria has tried mass repression. Saudi Arabia has tried mass bribery. They cut a check for $40 billion after the protests began in Egypt. So far, mass bribery is working better than mass repression. But you never know. It just feels as though something has been unlocked in these societies that is moving now. And even the places where there seems to have been effective repression or effective combination of repression and bribery, it probably will not last. Look at a place like Bahrain. You remember Bahrain is the small Gulf monarchy right next to Saudi Arabia. It is home. It is the base for America's Fifth Fleet, one of our largest naval bases in the world. And the regime there, which was actually a moderate regime, decided to deal with its protests by shutting them down, using a fair amount of force. And it seems to have worked. But look at why it worked. It has worked because the government of Bahrain had to ask in Saudi troops. So Bahrain has lost a fair degree of its actual national sovereignty. It has become a kind of Saudi protectorate. And more importantly, the division at the heart of Bahrain, which was what the protests were about, was the fact that a 30% Sunni minority rules a 70% Shia majority. When you lock that back up in a box, the one thing we have seen from the last 20 or 30 years, everywhere from Eastern Europe to Central Asia to the Middle East, is those kinds of deep divisions get worse. Repression very rarely works. Look at the Turks with their Kurdish population. Look anywhere in the world where you see these ethnic sectarian divides, and you will see that repression only makes the problem worse, and at some point the bottle will uncork. So I don't know that everything is going to change in the next 6 months, but I think if you ask yourself 5 years from now, will the governments, will the regimes in Libya, in Syria, in Jordan, in Yemen, look exactly the way they are now? It seems very unlikely. And so you're talking about a phenomenon of great depth, of great breadth. Now, how the United States should deal with this has been the great puzzle. And the United States has been trying to find its footing. The most important thing for us to realize is that the world that we lived in is vanishing. The world that we lived in was a world of dictatorships, of monarchies, of autocracies, and of an ability to disregard public attitudes and opinions, which has gone away. We are entering now a more modern Middle East, a more democratic Middle East, a more pluralistic Middle East, but also a more populist Middle East, right? So that what you see now happening in the councils of power in the Middle East is going to reflect a little bit more what the views of their public are. And you saw this in Egypt yesterday, when the Egyptian government decided that it was going to maintain restart relations with Iran and with Hamas, two organizations with which the Mubarak regime had no relations, largely on the urging of the United States. Now, the way the Egyptian government explained it was fascinating. They put it very bluntly. They said, we are becoming more democratic, and our foreign policy will reflect that. And they said, this is not a statement that says Iran is our friend. It is just a statement that says every other country in the world has relations with Iran. There are only two that don't, the United States and Israel. Similarly on Hamas, the Egyptian street position, the position of the Egyptian people, is very different from that of the Mubarak government. And what is happening is that the Egyptian foreign policy is coming more in line with that reality. If you wanted to see early a bellwether of all this, you could have seen it in Turkish foreign policy. Turkey, one of the strongest allies of the United States, a NATO member, a devoted military supporter, has participated in almost every American war except the Iraq War over the last 40 years. Well, what happened in Turkey over the last 10 years is a lot of people think that Turkey has become a more anti-American country. I'm not sure if that's true. The Turkey that we knew, loved, and trusted was really the Turkish military. What has happened is, over the last 10 years, Turkey has become more democratic. And the leaders of Turkey's government, who now actually control its foreign policy and national security policy, reflect that. And thus, they take a more pro-Palestinian position. They didn't involve themselves in the Iraq War. They are trying to broker various deals between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, just as the Egyptians did. All this is a reflection of what public attitudes towards foreign policy are. So this is the new Middle East we are going to confront, and we are beginning to realize it, and we are wondering what it will look like. And let me close by telling you why I think, even though in the narrow sense and in the short term, it looks like a defeat for America and for American foreign policy, it is actually a big win. Look, the reality is that if there was going to be any lasting peace in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine, it would have to be one that was accepted and accommodated not just by a handful of autocrats and dictators, but by the broad majority of the peoples in these countries. Otherwise, that peace was always going to be fragile, a peace of princes, not people. So this is now the beginning of an exploration, and I hope that Israel will participate in it, as to whether or not there can be meaningful negotiations and accommodations in which you create a two-state solution that diffuses this problem and reduces the level of tension in the region. I don't know that it will happen, but I know that this is an interesting start. But more broadly, the greatest danger to America that has emanated out of the Middle East over the last 20 years has been Islamic terrorism, has been Al-Qaeda, right? And what have these revolutions done over the last 3 months? They have destroyed the basic raison d'etre, the rationale for Al-Qaeda's existence. Remember what Al-Qaeda is. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization, an extremist organization, whose premise is this: the United States supports all these vicious dictatorships in the Middle East. The only way for us to destroy these dictatorships is to attack America. That is the principle on which Al-Qaeda is found. It's an Egyptian-Saudi partnership between opponents of the Egyptian dictatorship and opponents of the Saudi dictatorship. That was always the relationship. It was almost Saudi money in Egyptian brains. You could even see it on 9/11. There were 19 people in those planes. The 4 pilots were the 4 Egyptians, the brains. The 15 other people were Saudi. They were the brawn. They were the men who hustled the people at the back of the plane. That alliance was all about, in some way or the other, opposing these regimes in the Middle East. And what has happened in the last 3 months? Peaceful, non-Islamic demonstrations have toppled these regimes. And by the way, the United States has been largely accommodating of these changes. So imagine you're Osama bin Laden or you're Ayman Zawahiri, the number 2 man. What would you say in this circumstance? Well, you'd be a little stuck. And they were. For weeks on end, Al-Qaeda had nothing to say about the revolutions in the Arab world. Because, after all, they had been advocating the overthrow of these regimes, but they had insisted the only way you could do it was through an Islamist, extremist, violent route. And in fact, it had happened in a non-Islamist, non-extremist, non-violent route. And it had happened with the blessing of the United States, particularly in Egypt, when they had been convinced that the only way to do it was to oppose the United States and attack it. This single fact is, to my mind, the greatest gain for the United States and its interests of all the things we're talking about. And it is in a deep internal dynamic. They are now beginning to try, and Al-Qaeda has begun issuing statements, and Ayman Zawahiri has begun issuing statements, but they're incoherent because it is very difficult to craft a message that makes sense given the events. So I leave you just with this thought. We are entering a new phase. It's going to be a bumpy ride. It is going to be a roller coaster ride in some cases. But we have been for 75 years around the world telling the world to open up its societies, open up their politics, open themselves up to the world economy, open themselves up to modern technology. Finally, the Middle East is joining the modern world. We should be celebrating. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.